She does it always. She's just amazing. So this morning, we're concluding our series on change, where we've been exploring first how we can more graciously and courageously surrender to unexpected change, change that appears to be out of our control, by accepting that change, including loss and death, is not only inevitable but also essential to life. In essence, it's all part of the cycle of life. Recognizing that our resistance to change is largely a reaction to our fear of the unknown, which obviously doesn't prevent the change from happening, but does create more pain and suffering for us and may make us miss the potential lessons and blessings that are there. And finally, learning to suspend or at least pause our judgments about potential or actual change, remembering that life happens from the inside out, and that our perception of change has everything to do with how we experience it. Do we see it as a crisis, a disaster, or do we recognize it as life where everything has an opportunity and the potential for our growth? Now, I think it's important to clarify here what I mean when I say there are hidden blessings and in essence potential good in everything, especially acknowledging that seeking the good does not discount an authentic expression of sorrow or anger or even despair, nor does it mean we must call a painful loss or injustice or injury good. What it is saying is that within every situation and condition, there are opportunities for meaningful growth, for our hearts to be broken open into greater compassion and generosity of spirit, and ultimately, that it is possible to live with pain or loss without being held captive or being defined by it. Okay, so the next week, we built upon these embracing changes insights to know how we could increase our capacity to purposefully create change, meaningful change in our lives by making conscious choices. And that primarily involves choosing to do the inner work that underlies our continual growth, supporting us in becoming more spiritually mature and the fullest expression of God or good we're capable of being. And literally, to seek out change and challenges as opportunities for our growth and transformation by discovering and embracing and seeking to express our true identity as evolving spiritual beings, by heightening our self-awareness, and by expanding our structures of knowing. And last week there was a handout, I'm sure there's still some there, that goes into more detail about what those 3 items are about. Then last week, amidst our dramatic technical snafu, we adapted these same 3 practices to exploring how we can participate in affecting global change. In essence, how we can be the change we want to see in the world. Starting again with accepting, breathing into the current what is. Specifically, last week we were looking at an article that invited us to face a civilizational environmental crisis that can only be solved by unprecedented action on an unprecedented scale, meaning the climate crisis. Now note here, I am joining many who are no longer referring to what is as climate change. We've gotten beyond that process. We're deep into the change, and rather now we're in the reality of a crisis and disaster concerning our earth and our human participation with it. And as stated by the Guardian's editorial team, this is becoming the greatest threat to our human community that we have ever globally faced. And I shared last week that was actually, this article in response to this crisis is actually the motivation for this series on change. Teaching what I most need to learn, it seemed imperative to me that we all need to wake up to what is in our world and apply our spiritual principles so that we can face it with spiritual maturity. Especially developing that ability to answer the question, who do I choose to be in the midst of this? In essence, acting with wisdom and compassion while maintaining our inner and outer peace and equanimity, looking for how it is we're supposed to show up now as an expression of God and good in our world. The article I spoke to last week, One for All, aligns a concept with our teaching of oneness, saying, To avert global catastrophe, we urgently need to resurrect the ancient ideal of solidarity. In essence, to see our fates as linked and make good on that insight. This is a practical application of our spiritual principle of oneness and our mission to create a world that works for all. But as the article says, it also demands that we adopt a fundamentally different vision of human enterprise and shared endeavor than our current model. And there's the rub. Holding spiritual principle is one thing, discerning how we're supposed to live it in the world is another, especially when it's calling us to a radical transformation of our lives. Which brings us back to those three elements: discovering, embracing, and seeking to express our true identity as evolving spiritual beings, and heightening our self-awareness, in essence doing the inner work, because life happens from the inside out. And then expanding our structures of knowing so that we have information and knowledge to help give our spiritual guidance informed context. In this particular case, we're expanding our structures of knowing by exploring a practical application of oneness as in historically, envisioned in solidarity. In essence, a form of reciprocity rooted in the acknowledgement that our lives are intertwined, that informs the ways in which we are bound together and how we can act in concert to change our circumstances. So as we go through this article and this discussion of solidarity, I invite you to pay attention to your responses to this proposal and try to withhold judgment of the ideas in the proposal and also of your own reactions, simply allowing your mind to expand into new possibilities so that it's available for further discernment. Last week, what we talked about in this is how these kinds of global changes challenge a lot of our personal beliefs and fears and such. So this week, we're going to actually dive into this and watch what happens within ourselves. So I concluded last week alluding to some of the ways that this idea of solidarity challenges our nation in particular's current paradigm. But rather than discuss all the ways that the United States currently represents almost the antipathy of this concept, this morning I want to first expand our understanding of what solidarity is. Beginning with this 1895 quote by French statesman Léon Bourgeois, who wrote, "Man is born a debtor to humanity. From the moment we enter the world, we are bound into a web of relationships, past and future. And solidarity is the expression of the intrinsic debts we have to one another." French sociologist Emile Durkheim offered a more practical description when he summarized the findings of a 1900 conference in France on this matter, saying, "The Congress concluded with a resolution stating that the meaning and implications of the notion of solidarity, the idea of justice as the repayment of a social debt by the privileged to the underprivileged, assuming mutual interdependence and quasi-contractual obligations between all citizens, and implying a program of public education, social insurance, and labor and welfare legislations." Now clearly that ultimately is indicating that this author's idea of solidarity in practical terms is a version of democratic socialism, an idea that grew out of the lessons learned from the 2 world wars occurring within 1/2 of a century and leaving all participants, the so-called winners and losers, except the United States, fairly devastated. Great minds came together after 2 world wars in Europe to set about rebuilding a world that would be free of war, by addressing its ultimate cause, poverty. They surmised that Germany was driven to poverty by war reparations from World War I, and then turned to fascism, and then they made this link that poverty leads to ruin, leads to extremism, leads to fundamentalism, leads to fascism, leads to authoritarianism, and ultimately to war. It's sounding a little familiar, a little too familiar for me these days. Europe quickly took the lead, seeking to redesign its societies to be places of equality and opportunity and fairness, providing all its people with those things deemed essential to a decent life. In essence, the time, money, and freedom to live with dignity. But this utopian ideal was meant to stretch beyond Europe to the world, manifesting ultimately in the end of imperialism, and as the World Bank and the UN, and so on, with the point of these institutions being for richer nations to invest in poorer countries so as to continue to break the vicious cycle of poverty and violence that had come to rule our world. All in all, it proved to be a limited, definitely imperfect, but meaningful success. Unfortunately, the United States never fully embraced the lesson or the solution. We did initially adopt many of the ideals. We have free public education, we had unionized labor, we created Social Security, but clearly this concept of solidarity didn't fully take root. Perhaps because our homeland was spared from the immense devastation of World War I and II, reducing the depth of the lesson. We lost a lot of people, but we don't see bombed out centers wherever we go. Imagine living through 9/11 day after day for 3 or 4 years, and the different kind of impact that would have had on our country from what we have experienced. 9/11 really being the first time that we ever had experienced an outer nation attacking our homeland. Perhaps it was because we were still a vast and resource-rich nation with seemingly plenty of opportunity for all. Perhaps it was because we were, and still are, immersed in our own original sin, which kept us distracted and focused on segregation rather than solidarity. And perhaps because America never fully accepted the lesson that poverty causes ruin. Rather, we seem to, as demonstrated by our institutions, to view poverty as a kind of just desert, a form of deserved consequence or punishment for being too lazy, too foolish, too slow, too weak, or the wrong color, the wrong religion, or the wrong gender. We have clung to equal opportunity rather than a social network. So rather than a social contract that ensures all people the essentials of modern living, the United States put its money literally on the markets, believing them to be the truest judge of a person's worth and worthiness. And we put our collective social welfare into the realm of charity and its institutionalized counterpart, philanthropy, which has both sustained and exacerbated our systemic inequality. To paraphrase the One for All article, people of means have long preferred charity to solidarity. Under the virtuous-sounding guise of charity, the rich and powerful can bestow kindness from on high without feeling implicated in or responsible for the systems that produce poverty and oppression in the first place. In short, philanthropy is structured so as to leave the distinction between the giver and the receiver intact. Donors and patrons reap praises for their generosity without having to engage in any serious consideration about the sorts of changes that might produce a fairer society in which billionaire philanthropists no longer exist. Solidarity, in contrast of charity and philanthropy, isn't one-sided. Rather, it's a form of reciprocity rooted in the acknowledgement that our lives are intertwined, as effectively demonstrated by the CEO Dan Price in our Good News statement. It's returning to the radical indigenous understanding and wisdom that the earth belongs to no one person, no one corporation, or even to humanity. Rather, we are stewards called to caretake and sustain all of creation for all of creation. Is everybody still breathing? The reality is these are radical ideas. And I'm not sure that democratic socialism is the answer, but clearly it's time for us to look at our values of oneness, our Christian teachings of community, and see how we can apply them in reality, in practicality to our world. There's also an important proviso that intertwined doesn't mean indistinguishable, because solidarity at its core recognizes that we're not all exactly alike. In complex ways, solidarity is related to, but distinct from our identity. As explained by Chris Hayes in his essay, In Search of Solidarity, in its more mundane form, solidarity relates to what is often called identity politics, uniting like to like. But it's in its more sublime register, in the way we would apply our spiritual principles. Solidarity has a group or individuals gazing outward, reaching past similarity towards something more spacious, in essence, to something like inclusivity or oneness. A solidarity aimed at transforming change, which is what this article says we now need and what it seems like the crisis is calling for, demands that we not just recognize and sympathize with the plight of others, but also join them as equals, reaching across the differences without erasing them. Solidarity in this sublime form shatters the boundaries of identity, connecting us to others even when we are not the same. Which of course is the practical meaning of oneness and the prerequisite for creating a world that works for all. In essence, forming and affirming social and political relationships across differences, uniting people around not just common interests, but about the common economic interests of all, including the earth. Finally, it's essential to clarify that solidarity as an outward demonstration of an inner awareness is not a feeling or affect. It's not a fuzzy sense of connection or unity, nor a pre-existing bond within an established, stable group or tribe. Unlike identity, solidarity is not something we have, it is something we do. A set of actions taken towards a common goal. In essence, it is living our truth. Inasmuch as it is something to be experienced, it's not a given, but it must be generated. It must be made, not found. Solidarity both produces community and is rooted in it, and is thus both a means and an end. Solidarity is the practice of helping people realize that we are all in this together, and that the conditions that affect any of us ultimately affect all of us. Once again, our human race is on the brink of disaster. We've successfully, if perilously, negotiated the nuclear brink we created for almost a century now. But now we must rise to this crisis, to the radical transformation necessary to avert this impending environmental crisis that we are choosing to participate and create in a range of ways. And perhaps more importantly, to answer the question, who will I be in the midst of this crisis? I'll close with this story called My Neighbor's Corn. There was once a farmer who grew excellent quality corn. Every year he won the award for the best corn. A newspaper reporter, wanting to discover his secret, interviewed the farmer, who said, "My secret is I share my best seeds with my neighbors." Incredulously, the reporter asked, "But how can you afford to share your best seed corn with your neighbors when they're entering in the same competition with you every year?" To which the farmer replied, "The wind picks up pollen from the ripening corn and swirls it from field to field. If my neighbors grow inferior corn, cross-pollination will steadily degrade the quality of my corn. So if I'm to grow good corn, I must help my neighbors grow good corn as well." And finally, I leave you again with this encouraging reminder from Amma. I think it should be a mantra for all of us. Don't be discouraged by your incapacity to dispel darkness from the world. Light your little candle and step forward. Namaste. any tension you may be feeling. If it's comfortable, put your feet flat on the floor so you can experience your connection to Mother Earth. Hands relaxed in your lap, ideally palms up, symbolizing openness and receptivity to new ideas. And if it's comfortable, close your eyes and begin to focus on your breath. This idea of change, as we've been discussing, creates mixed feelings in us. From fear to excitement, from joy to resistance. And the bigger the change, the more expanded are these feelings. As I invited at the beginning of the lesson, I invite you to just pay attention to the feelings that are coming up as we consider the radical changes that we're facing as a world. Radical changes that will happen if we go on living just as we are. Radical changes that will happen if we choose to actively address what we see happening in the world. I believe that there are divine ideas that will guide us through these challenges if we're open and receptive. So this morning, in exploring, expanding our structures of knowing, I'm creating a space for us to feel and be open to different, new, seemingly radical ideas. It's only in entertaining ideas that are outside of our comfort zone that we will be open to hearing new ideas, unprecedented ideas that can guide us into a new future. It may not be these ideas, but the exercise, the willingness to have open minds and open hearts is essential to following the guidance we hear. The guidance that will guide us into a new world that is different in kind and in degree from the one we currently live in. So I invite you to just spend a few moments now in the silence with all of the feelings that come as we embrace change in the silence. And as we begin to bring our attention back to this room and this time, we invoke the presence of the great compassion. Let us fill our hearts with our own compassion towards ourselves and towards all beings. May all living beings realize that they are brothers and sisters, all nourished from the same source of life. May we ourselves cease to be the cause of suffering to each other. May we live in a way that will not deprive other beings of air, water, food, shelter, or the chance to live fully. With humility, with awareness of the existence of life and of the sufferings that are going on around us, let us pray for the establishment of peace in our hearts and on earth. Amen. And so it is. Amen and amen.